I used to believe that secrets belonged in crime stories and mystery novels. I never imagined the biggest secret of my life was quietly sitting inside my own home. For 10 years, I believed I was living in a peaceful marriage built on trust and stability. My husband Daniel and I shared a life that looked ordinary from the outside. We had routines that rarely changed. We woke up early, drank coffee together in the kitchen, and talked about simple things like work schedules and weekend plans. In the evenings, we cooked dinner, watched television, and fell asleep on the couch like many couples who had settled comfortably into married life. It wasn't an exciting life, but it felt safe. And safety was something I valued deeply. Everything about our relationship seemed predictable. That is why the truth, when it finally appeared, then felt almost impossible to believe. Daniel and I met at a dinner gathering hosted by mutual friends. The evening was loud and cheerful, with people sharing stories and laughing across the table. Daniel stood out immediately because he wasn't trying to dominate the conversation. He listened carefully, speaking only when he had something thoughtful to add. There was something calm and steady about him that drew my attention almost immediately. A few days later, he asked if I would like to meet for coffee. Our first date was simple and relaxed, and by the end of the evening, I felt strangely comfortable around him. Daniel had a way of making ordinary moments feel peaceful. He never rushed anything and seemed genuinely interested in learning about my life, my work, and the small details that mattered to me. Our relationship developed slowly over the next 2 years. Daniel called regularly, showed up exactly when he said he would, and remembered the things I mentioned in passing conversations. Those small gestures created a sense of reliability that made me trust him completely. When he proposed during a quiet dinner near the river, I did not hesitate before saying yes. It felt like the natural next step in a relationship that had always seemed calm and stable. Our families celebrated the engagement enthusiastically, and friends often told us how well we seemed to fit together. Looking back now, I realize that Daniel had already mastered something very important. He knew exactly how to appear trustworthy. The early years of our marriage were peaceful in the way many people imagine when they think about long-term relationships. We both worked during the week and spent weekends catching up on small errands or visiting family. Daniel enjoyed structure and routines, and I appreciated the stability that came with that personality. Occasionally, he traveled for work. According to him, his company required him to visit different cities to meet with clients. The trips were never very long, usually 2 or 3 days at a time. I never questioned them. His explanations always sounded reasonable, and he often returned home with small gifts or stories about the places he had visited. At the time, I believed those trips were simply part of his job. As the years passed, our life together settled into a comfortable rhythm. Daniel remained calm and dependable, rarely showing strong emotions. Our friends sometimes joked that our marriage seemed unusually peaceful compared to the dramatic relationships they often described. But small changes began appearing that I couldn't fully explain. Daniel started guarding his phone more carefully. He occasionally stepped into another room to answer calls, explaining that work conversations required privacy. Each time I asked about it, he offered simple answers that sounded perfectly reasonable. I told myself that every marriage included moments of misunderstanding, and I pushed the uneasy feeling out of my mind. 10 years passed this way, 10 years of ordinary mornings and quiet evenings, 10 years of believing my marriage was exactly what it appeared to be. Everything changed on a rainy Thursday evening. Daniel had fallen asleep early on the couch after returning from work. When I needed to send an email, and his laptop was already sitting open on the table beside him. Without thinking twice, I opened the computer and began searching through the folders for the document I needed. At first, everything looked normal. The screen showed spreadsheets, work reports, and neatly organized documents related to Daniel's job. I scrolled through the folders casually, expecting nothing unusual. Then I noticed one folder that I did not recognize. The name was simple: Family. Curious, I clicked on the folder. Inside were dozens of photographs. The first few images looked harmless enough. Daniel standing in a park. Daniel sitting at a restaurant table. Daniel smiling beside a woman I had never seen before. At first, I assumed she might be a coworker or perhaps a distant relative. But as I continued scrolling, the uneasy feeling in my chest grew stronger. More photographs appeared. The same woman standing beside Daniel in different places. Then I saw the children. A little boy and a little girl stood beside him with their arms wrapped around his waist. The three of them were smiling brightly, the way families often smile during birthdays or vacations. I stared at the image for several seconds before something inside me finally broke through the confusion. The children looked exactly like Daniel. The moment I realized the children resembled Daniel, a strange silence filled the room around me. The rain outside continued tapping against the windows, but everything else seemed to fade away. I stared at the photograph, hoping my mind had somehow misunderstood what I was seeing. But the resemblance was impossible to ignore. Mine, the little boy, had Daniel's eyes and the same small dimple in his left cheek when he smiled. The little girl looked younger, maybe 6 or 7 years old, but she also carried that same unmistakable expression that belonged to my husband. My heart began beating faster as I continued scrolling through the images. There were photographs taken in parks, restaurants, and what appeared to be birthday celebrations. In one picture, the little girl stood beside a cake covered in pink frosting while Daniel knelt beside her, smiling proudly as if he had organized the entire celebration. In another image, the boy held a small soccer trophy while Daniel stood behind him with his hands resting on the child's shoulders. Each photograph told the same quiet story. Daniel had been present for moments that only fathers usually attend. I kept scrolling. I'm unable to stop myself, even though every new image made the truth harder to ignore. Some photographs showed the same woman I had noticed earlier. She appeared in nearly every picture, always standing close to Daniel with a relaxed familiarity that suggested their connection was more than casual. She looked comfortable beside him, the way someone looks when they believe they belong exactly where they are. In one photograph, the four of them stood in front of a small house with a white fence. The children held balloons while Daniel and the woman stood behind them, smiling like parents posing proudly with their family. I felt a cold heaviness settle into my chest. That was not just a random moment captured by a camera, that was a family portrait. The realization arrived slowly but with terrifying clarity. And Daniel hadn't simply been seeing another woman. The photographs suggested something much larger and much more carefully constructed. The children appeared in pictures taken across many different seasons. Summer trips to the beach, winter holidays near a decorated tree, birthday celebrations that happened year after year. This was not a recent development. This life had existed for a long time. I noticed the date in the corner of one of the photos and leaned closer to the screen. The image had been taken 8 years earlier. In it, the boy looked younger, perhaps 4 years old, while Daniel stood beside him holding a wrapped gift. 8 years. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Daniel and I had already been married for 2 years when that photograph was taken. My mind began racing through memories of the past decade. I'm searching for moments that suddenly seemed suspicious. The work trips that had always seemed routine. The occasional late nights when Daniel claimed he needed to meet with clients. The times he returned home looking distracted or distant. Each memory now carried a completely different meaning. Daniel had not been traveling for work, he had been visiting another life. The laptop screen continued glowing in front of me as I explored the rest of the folder. Beneath the photographs were several scanned documents. Curiosity pushed me to open one of them. It appeared to be a school report for the little boy I had seen in the pictures. At the top of the page was the child's name. Under the section labeled Parent or Guardian, Daniel's full name was written clearly. I stared at the document for a long time, hoping there was still some explanation that could make sense of everything. But the truth was already forming in my mind. Daniel was not just visiting these children, he was their father. I closed the document and leaned back in the chair, trying to slow my breathing. From the living room, I could still hear the quiet sound of Daniel sleeping on the couch. The ordinary rhythm of his breathing felt strangely unsettling now. For 10 years, he had moved through our life together as if nothing was unusual. He had shared meals with me, celebrated holidays with my family, and slept beside me every night. All while maintaining another family only a short distance away. The thought was so overwhelming that I almost closed the laptop and pretended none of it had happened. And part of me desperately wanted to wake Daniel and demand answers immediately. But another part of me realized that if I confronted him too quickly, he might find a way to explain everything before I understood the full story. So instead, I did something unexpected. I remained silent. Over the next few days, I began observing Daniel more carefully than I ever had before. I watched how often he checked his phone and noticed how quickly he turned the screen away whenever I walked past. I paid attention to the small pauses in his conversations and the subtle tension in his voice when certain messages appeared. Daniel behaved exactly the way he always had: calm, organized, and completely confident that his secret was safe. 3 days later, something happened that confirmed everything I had already begun to suspect. Daniel left his phone on the kitchen counter while he went upstairs to shower. Normally, he never allowed his phone to remain unattended. But that morning, he seemed distracted. The screen lit up with a message notification. I looked down almost instinctively. The message contained only a few words. "Are you coming tonight?" Below the text was a heart emoji. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen, feeling the weight of the situation press down on me. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the phone. I hesitated before unlocking it, knowing that once I looked inside, there would be no way to return to the comfortable ignorance I had lived in for so many years. Finally, I opened the message thread. The conversation stretched back for months, maybe years. The messages were simple, but deeply revealing. And they discussed school events, dinner plans, and small details about the children's daily lives. The woman occasionally thanked Daniel for helping with homework or attending a school meeting. She spoke to him with the easy familiarity of someone who believed they were speaking to a devoted partner. One message stood out among the others. It read, "The kids can't wait to see their dad tonight." The word dad seemed to echo in my mind long after I closed the phone and placed it back exactly where Daniel had left it. When Daniel returned to the kitchen a few minutes later, he greeted me with the same calm smile he had worn for years. He asked if I wanted coffee and began talking about an upcoming meeting at work. I listened quietly, realizing that the man speaking to me had become someone I barely recognized. And that evening, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. If Daniel truly had another family, I needed to see that life with my own eyes. The documents inside the laptop folder contained an address connected to the school records. It was located only 40 minutes away from our home. The following afternoon, I drove to that address. The neighborhood looked peaceful and quiet, filled with small houses and neatly trimmed gardens. It was the kind of place where families raised children and neighbors greeted each other across fences. When I turned the final corner, I immediately recognized the house from the photographs. The white fence, the narrow garden path, the small front porch. Everything looked exactly the same. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Daniel's car was parked in the driveway. And Daniel's car sitting in that driveway made the entire situation feel painfully real. For a few seconds, I remained inside my own car, gripping the steering wheel as if it might somehow steady the storm of thoughts rushing through my mind. Until that moment, everything I had discovered existed only on a laptop screen or inside a phone message. Seeing Daniel's car parked beside that small house removed every remaining doubt. I stepped out of the car slowly and walked toward the sidewalk across from the house. The neighborhood was quiet. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower hummed faintly and a dog barked in the distance. Ordinary sounds filled the afternoon, the kind of peaceful background noise people rarely notice. But my attention was fixed on the backyard. From where I stood, I could see part of the yard through a gap in the wooden fence. And Daniel was there. He was kneeling on the grass beside the little boy from the photographs, helping him assemble what looked like a toy airplane. The boy laughed when the wings finally snapped into place. The little girl ran past them, holding a bright red balloon, her laughter echoing across the yard. Near the porch, the woman I had seen in the photos sat in a garden chair, watching them with a relaxed smile. They looked like a perfectly ordinary family enjoying a quiet afternoon together. For several minutes, I simply watched them, unable to move. My mind struggled to accept what my eyes were seeing. The man laughing with those children was the same man who had shared my breakfast table that very morning. Daniel lifted the toy airplane and pretended to launch it into the air. When the boy ran after it excitedly while the little girl clapped her hands. The woman stood up and walked toward Daniel, placing her hand gently on his shoulder as they both watched the children play. It was a small gesture, but it carried the kind of natural familiarity that only comes from years of shared life. In that moment, I understood something that hurt more deeply than I expected. Daniel had not been living a careless affair. He had been living a complete second life. The boy eventually ran back toward Daniel with the airplane in his hands. Daniel ruffled his hair and said something that made the child laugh again. I could not hear the words from where I stood, but the tone of his voice sounded warm and affectionate, the same voice he used when he spoke to me. I realized then that I had been standing there for several minutes without breathing properly. My chest felt tight as if the air itself had become heavier. Part of me wanted to walk away immediately, return to my car, and pretend I had never seen any of it. But another part of me refused to leave without facing the truth completely. So I stepped closer to the fence. The wooden boards creaked slightly beneath my hand, and the small sound caught someone's attention. The little girl stopped running and looked toward the fence. For a moment, she stared at me curiously, trying to figure out why a stranger was standing there. Then she called out loudly, "Daddy, someone's here." The word struck me harder than anything else I had heard that day. Daniel turned around. The moment his eyes met mine, his entire expression changed. The easy smile disappeared from his face, replaced by a look of shock so intense that he seemed unable to move. The color drained from his face as if someone had suddenly removed all the air from his lungs. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The woman beside him looked from Daniel to me, clearly confused by his reaction. She stepped forward slightly, studying my face as if trying to recognize me. Daniel finally stood up slowly, his movements stiff and uncertain. I could see the panic forming behind his eyes. He walked toward the fence, stopping a few steps away from where I stood. "Emily," he said quietly. Hearing my name spoken in that place felt strangely surreal. The woman's expression changed immediately. "Emily?" she repeated. Her eyes moved back to Daniel, searching for an explanation. I might realize then that Daniel had probably never expected this moment to happen. For 10 years, he had managed to keep his two lives completely separate. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves when people least expect it. The woman approached the fence slowly, still watching Daniel's face. "Who is she?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. His mouth opened slightly as if he were preparing to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched long enough for the truth to become obvious. So I answered the question myself. "My name is Emily," I said calmly. "I'm Daniel's wife." The woman blinked in confusion. For a moment, she looked as though she hadn't heard me correctly. "Your wife?" she said slowly. Her voice carried the same disbelief that had filled my own mind when I first opened that laptop folder. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to find the right words. But every possible explanation seemed to collapse before he could speak it. The little boy had stopped playing with the airplane and was now watching the adults with a puzzled expression. The girl held her balloon tightly, sensing that something serious was happening even if she didn't understand what it meant. The woman turned toward Daniel again. "You told me your wife passed away years ago," she said. The sentence fell into the quiet afternoon like a stone dropped into still water. For a moment, I felt as if the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Daniel had not only hidden another family from me, he had erased me from his story completely. To them, I had been gone for years. The woman's expression hardened as she studied Daniel's face. "Daniel," she said quietly, "but what is going on?" Daniel looked between the two of us, realizing that the life he had carefully balanced for a decade was finally collapsing. There were no more stories left to tell. No explanations that could make the situation acceptable. For the first time since I had known him, Daniel looked like a man who had completely lost control. I watched him standing there in the yard between the two families he had created, and I understood something very clearly. The life I thought I had shared with him had never truly existed. It had only been one half of a lie. Daniel stood there for several long seconds without speaking. The calm confidence he had carried for so many years seemed to disappear completely. His shoulders looked tense, and his eyes moved back and forth between the two of us as if he were trying to calculate which explanation might cause the least damage. But the truth had already revealed itself. The woman crossed her arms slowly, watching him with an expression that was no longer confused. It was the expression of someone beginning to understand that the person she trusted had been hiding something enormous. "Daniel," she said again, more firmly this time, "I asked you a question." Daniel took a slow breath. "I can explain," he said quietly. It was the same sentence people often use when the truth has already become impossible to hide. The woman shook her head slightly. "Then explain it," she replied. Daniel looked toward me again, and I could see a mixture of panic and regret in his eyes. But whatever explanation he was searching for did not seem to exist. Finally, he spoke. I never meant for either of you to get hurt. The sentence sounded empty even as it left his mouth. For a moment, none of us said anything. The children watched us carefully, sensing that something serious was happening, even though they could not understand the full meaning of the conversation. The little boy walked closer to Daniel and tugged gently at his sleeve. Dad, he said softly, what's going on? Daniel looked down at him, and something in his expression shifted slightly. The confident man I had known for 10 years seemed to fade, replaced by someone who looked suddenly tired. The woman placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder and guided both children toward the porch. Go inside for a minute, she told them gently. Wait, we'll talk soon. The children hesitated for a moment before slowly walking toward the house. Once they were inside, the woman turned back toward us. Her eyes moved between Daniel and me, and the full weight of the situation seemed to settle across her face. So, let me understand this, she said carefully. You're saying that you're married to her? Daniel nodded slowly. And you've been married for 10 years. He nodded again. The woman let out a long breath, the kind people release when they are trying to absorb something that feels almost impossible. You told me your wife died, she said quietly. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. I know. The woman stared at him for several seconds, and I could see the moment when the final pieces of the truth fell into place in her mind. You've been living two lives, she said. Daniel didn't respond. But his silence confirmed everything. The woman looked away toward the yard where the children had been playing only a few minutes earlier. Her voice was calmer now, but there was a sharp edge of disbelief beneath it. How long? She asked. Daniel hesitated again. About 10 years. The words seemed to hang in the air. 10 years, 10 years of lies, carefully arranged so that neither of us would discover the other. The woman turned slowly toward me. I didn't know, she said. Her voice sounded sincere, and for the first time since arriving there, I realized something important. She had been deceived just as completely as I had. Daniel had not only betrayed one family, he had betrayed both of them. I believe you, I said quietly. Daniel looked at me with surprise, as if he hadn't expected those words. But the truth was clear. The shock in her eyes was genuine. She had not been acting the part of someone involved in a secret affair. She had believed Daniel's story, just like I had. The woman shook her head slowly. I can't believe this, she said. For years you've been telling me you were alone. You told me you lost your wife before we even met. Daniel looked down at the ground. I didn't know how to fix it once it started, he said. The explanation sounded weak and meaningless. Because lies that last 10 years are never accidents. They are choices made again and again. The woman stepped backward slightly, putting more distance between herself and Daniel. Fix it, she said. You built an entire life on a lie. Daniel looked helpless. I cared about both of you, he said quietly. The sentence felt almost absurd. And caring about people rarely involves deceiving them for a decade. The woman looked at him with an expression that was no longer confused or shocked. Now it was simply clear. You didn't care, she said calmly. You just thought you could keep both lives forever. Daniel said nothing, because there was no honest way to deny it. For several seconds, the three of us stood there in silence, each of us realizing that the life we thought we had known had been built on something fragile. Finally, the woman spoke again. You should go, she said to Daniel. Daniel looked at her, startled. What? You heard me, she replied. Leave. Daniel glanced toward the house where the children had disappeared. But the kids? They'll be fine, she said firmly. Oh, right now they don't need to hear whatever excuses you're about to invent. Daniel looked as though he wanted to argue, but the determination in her voice stopped him. For the first time since arriving there, he seemed to understand that he no longer had control over what happened next. He turned toward me slowly. Emily, he said, please, we should talk. I studied his face for a moment. The man standing in front of me looked familiar, but at the same time he felt like someone I had never truly known. For 10 years I had trusted him completely. Now I understood that trust had been built on something imaginary. "There's nothing left to talk about," I said quietly. Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly. He looked around the yard one more time, as if searching for something that might repair the damage that had already been done. But the truth had already broken everything. Without another word, I turned and began walking back toward my car. Behind me, I could hear Daniel calling my name once more. But this time, I didn't stop. I walked back toward my car slowly, trying to steady the storm of thoughts rushing through my mind. The quiet neighborhood suddenly felt different from when I had first arrived. Just minutes earlier, it had seemed peaceful and ordinary. Now every sound felt strangely distant, as if I were watching the world from somewhere outside my own life. When I reached the car, I paused before opening the door. My hands were still trembling slightly, and I realized that the truth I had discovered was only beginning to settle in. For 10 years, I had lived beside a man I thought I understood. But the man I had married and the man I had just seen in that backyard were not the same person. I sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes before starting the engine. In the rearview mirror, I could see Daniel still standing near the fence. From that distance, he looked smaller somehow, like someone who had suddenly lost the stability he once relied on. Part of me expected him to run toward the car, to knock on the window and beg me to listen to whatever explanation he had prepared. But he didn't move. Instead, he simply stood there. Perhaps he had finally realized that there were no words capable of repairing what had been destroyed. I drove away slowly, leaving the neighborhood behind. The entire drive home felt strangely quiet. My mind replayed everything I had seen in that backyard. The children laughing, the woman sitting peacefully in the garden chair, Daniel helping the little boy build the toy airplane. It had looked like a happy family. And somehow, that detail hurt more than anything else. Because it meant Daniel had not simply been careless. He had invested years into maintaining that second life. When I arrived home, the house felt unfamiliar. The same living room where Daniel and I had spent countless evenings now seemed strangely empty. His jacket was still hanging on the chair where he had left it that morning, and his coffee mug remained on the kitchen counter. Everything looked exactly the same, but the meaning behind those ordinary objects had changed completely. I walked through the room slowly, noticing details that had never seemed important before: the framed photographs from our vacations, the books we had bought together, the small souvenirs from places we had visited during our marriage. For years, I had believed those memories represented something genuine. Now they felt like scenes from a story that had been written only halfway. Later that evening, Daniel returned home. I heard the door open quietly and his footsteps moving through the hallway. When he entered the living room, he looked exhausted, as if the weight of the entire day had finally settled on his shoulders. For a moment, he simply stood there, unsure of what to say. "I never wanted you to find out like this," he said eventually. His voice sounded softer than usual, almost uncertain. I looked at him calmly. "There was never going to be a good way to find out," I replied. Daniel lowered himself slowly into the chair across from me, and the silence between us stretched for several seconds before he spoke again. "It started years ago," he said, "before you and I got married." I listened without interrupting. He explained that he had met the other woman during a difficult period in his life. According to him, their relationship had already begun before he met me, and he had believed it would eventually end. But it never did. Instead, he said, the situation became more complicated when the children were born. By then, he had already built relationships with both of us, and rather than choosing one life, he continued trying to maintain both. The explanation sounded strangely logical when he described it, but logic did not make it acceptable. "You lied to both of us," I said quietly. Daniel nodded slowly. "I know." The honesty in that moment felt almost surprising. Then for 10 years, he had constructed careful stories to hide the truth. Now that the secret had been exposed, there was nothing left to protect. We talked for a long time that evening. The conversation moved slowly, sometimes interrupted by long stretches of silence. Daniel answered my questions honestly, perhaps because he finally understood that the truth could no longer be avoided. By the time the conversation ended, one thing had become clear. The life we had built together could not continue. Over the next few months, we began the process of separating our lives. The divorce itself was quiet and straightforward. Daniel moved into a small apartment while I remained in the house until everything was finalized. During that time, I often thought about the moment when I opened that folder on his laptop. When a single click had revealed a truth that had existed for 10 years without my knowledge. In the months that followed, I also thought about the woman I had met in that backyard. Like me, she had trusted Daniel's words completely. Like me, she had believed she understood the person she was building a life with. Both of us had been wrong. Eventually, the legal process ended, and Daniel disappeared from my daily life entirely. The routines that once defined our marriage slowly faded away. At first, the silence felt uncomfortable, but over time, something unexpected happened. The silence began to feel peaceful. One evening, I found myself sitting by the window, watching the sunset across the city. The sky was painted in soft shades of orange and gold, and the streets below moved slowly as people returned home from work. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to relief. Daniel had taken 10 years of my life, but he had not taken the future that still remained ahead of me. Sometimes the truth arrives in the most painful way imaginable. It breaks apart the stories we believed and forces us to see reality clearly. But the truth also carries a strange kind of freedom. Once it appears, the lies that once controlled your life lose their power. And from that moment forward, the path ahead becomes your own again. As the story came to an end, I often found myself thinking about how easily trust can be broken and how long it can take to rebuild your life afterward. Sometimes the truth arrives in ways we never expect. It forces us to see people clearly and reminds us that our future does not have to be defined by someone else's mistakes. And now I'm curious to hear your thoughts. If you were in my situation and discovered your partner had been hiding another family for 10 years, what would you do? Would you walk away immediately, or would you try to hear their explanation first? Share your thoughts in the comments because I read every single one. And while you're there, tell me where you're watching from today. Whether you're listening from Toronto, Chicago, London, Sydney, or anywhere else in the world, I'd love to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoy stories like this and want to hear more real-life drama and powerful life lessons, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Mind Tales by Kiyomi so you never miss the next story.